Good morning. We have a bright sunny September's day here in Sweden. It is just stunning. Oddly enough, not a single cloud, and both the sun and the moon are up at the same time. And even odder, the moon is on a steeper angle than the sun. Well, welcome to Sweden. The moon you have over there. I will, this weekend, or this Saturday, I will begin with temporality in Heidegger. It is a subject that we've neglected. The reason being, it is very hard to understand. With help of Carlo Rovello and his Rovelli, his relational quantum mechanics, I came to an understanding of the time in Heidegger. So we need our leads here and there. And it was also helpful with the Lotka-Verrucelli problem, the bunny and the fox. And that led me to understand, there are several proofs and openers towards this fixation that we usually call the classical model. Lotka-Verrucelli showed already in the 1920s that a static reality doesn't work evolutionary or even rationally. So that's yet one more proof to add to the list. We have the discovery of 1887. We have quantum mechanics. We have Gödel. Kalle, could I ask you to put a little bit of your shirt on top of that one?
Excuse me?
There, you put a little bit on that.
I don't understand what is your...
No, you can sit please.
No.
Yeah, a little bit like that. Just the left one. That's the only one that bothers me.
Okay, you mean...
Yeah, you can sit in the same spot. Sorry,
okay.
I got a very bright shine in my eyes. Lotka-Verrucelli showed it the impossibility that any animal can live in a world that is focused with its logocentric now. And then we have the theorem of Gödel, also in the 20s. So oddly enough, a lot happened in the 20s, except from the discovery in 1887. Almost exactly 100 years after Principias. 200 years. My colleague had the very nicety of sending me a few takeouts of the big Heidegger Lexicon by Wrathall, and I will start the going into temporality with consciousness. And Heidegger doesn't mention much of consciousness. It is a word that he avoids for good reasons. It is infected with the classical model, and every time you use it, you bring the whole spectra of the classical model once into existence. But I think we are safe now. I think we've done so much work, so there is little risk of us falling into the trap of the classical model. So we might be able to use consciousness without the idea of a transcendental consciousness or some otherworldly, substanceless, transparent consciousness that still exists somehow. Let me read you here from the Heidegger Dictionary, Lexicon. Consciousness, Bewusstsein. Consciousness, the capacity for thought, sentience, and awareness, is not a proprietary technical term of Heidegger's, but it does figure frequently in his lifelong dialogue with modern thinkers from Descartes up to Husserl. As Heidegger says early in his 1923 lecture, in Greek philosophy there is no concept of consciousness. Many of his substantive discussions of realism, intentionality, temporality, etc. are tied to his engagement with modern theories of consciousness. So more may be found by looking at those entries, particularly that of intentionality. That's another part of the book. In the 17th century, philosophical theories of human being came to focus on the conscious mind and to see it as that which defines us and sets us apart from other entities. Consciousness, which term is cognate to and, depending on the language, identical with conscience, was often understood in terms of a kind of fundamental self-transparency, the knowledge of one's existence and the awareness of the thoughts, perceptions, emotions, volitions within oneself. This self-awareness was also usually tied to our ability to have objective knowledge more generally, and to our ability to act intentionally. Whether consciousness requires all this, or whether a broader understanding, one on which animals, for instance, count as conscious, is to be preferred, was and remains a subject of intense dispute. Descartes famously argued that this sphere of self-awareness, which he equated with thought and thinking, provides knowledge that is certain in a way no other knowledge is, and that knowledge of the totality of the finite things outside of oneself is, by comparison, less certain and in need of demonstration. This epistemological gap reflects a metaphysical gap between the conscious mind and the world, and much of modern thought has been addressed to bridging or otherwise coming to terms with it. Still suffering for a cold here, and sorry about the nasty videos with coughing and snoring and sneezing and all that. Hopefully it will be gone in a couple of days. It is leaving me slowly. Very nicely put by Wrathall. Do you like it? In the early 20th century, Edmund Husserl, following Franz Brentano, identify the characteristic feature of the conscious mind as intentionality. It's being always, in each of its acts, directed towards something. Husserl then took phenomenology to have as its aim the science of consciousness, that is, a pure or transcendental account of the basic forms intentionality can take, the development of which requires a reduction in which the reality of the intended entities is bracketed, in order that the form of the conscious acts may themselves become intentional objects, and so be systematically studied. In this way, phenomenology is to be distinguished from the empirical sciences, including psychology, which are specific modes of intentional directedness that posit their objects as existing, but do not thematize them and the intentional acts that are themselves involved in this positing. Phenomenology was thus, for Husserl, a kind of non-positive ur-science, a descriptive eidetic science of transcendental pure consciousness that provided a science of all other positive sciences, as Heidegger put it. Readers of Husserl disagree as to whether his phenomenology preserves or overcomes the metaphysical gap between consciousness and the world, characteristic of Cartesian dualism. Readers of Heidegger in turn disagree as to how much his project is aligned with Husserl's and how much it departs from it. But whether fairly or not, Heidegger took pains to criticize and distance himself from Husserl. But whether his consciousness-focused conception of phenomenology seemed to bear against Heidegger. Thus, he argued that Husserlian phenomenology was driven by the same care, Sorge, for theoretical knowing, science, and the certainty of already known knowledge. So his criticism is that Husserl do the mistake, according to Heidegger, to go to the already known knowledge when in explaining consciousness. And this is called erkannte Erkenntnis. Something obviously also steered Descartes, and also consciousness-centered modern epistemology after him. A few exceptions, but James Gibson obviously is one. In other words, an overriding need for and commitment to security of human knowledge and existence, forced attention on conscious mind and demanded it be treated as an object capable of being elucidated and understood according to the standards of clarity and rigor characteristic of mathematics. While Husserl was a professor of mathematics. Heidegger thought that this distorted the very phenomena of mind that was ostensibly being understood. It obscured the fact of insecurity in human existence. It failed to recognize that striving for certainty is only one way to care about existence. It missed the ways in which various forms of opacity and hiddenness are necessarily bound up with any transparency or illumination. And it generated the idea that we exist in a cabinet of consciousness, which we must somehow find our way out of to encounter the world, rather than recognizing that to be minded or conscious is already to be in the world. Thus, in the 1920s, rather than Bewusstsein, Heidegger offered an analysis of Dasein. Heidegger claimed that the intentionality of consciousness highlighted by Husserl is in fact grounded in the ecstatical unity of Dasein, explicated in being and time, as he put it in his 1929-30 lectures on the fundamental concepts of metaphysics. He saw the task of philosophy as thus being not to describe the consciousness of man, but to evoke the Dasein in man. A similar contrast can still be found decades later in the 1973 Säringen seminar, indicated Heidegger's abiding preoccupation with the central modern view of human essence. However much he rejected the specific understanding of consciousness as a kind of self-contained sphere or cabinet, known first and better than anything else, and whatever shortcomings and blind spots he found in the work of his predecessors, Heidegger was nevertheless very much interested throughout his career in many other phenomena that traditional theories of consciousness were trying to understand. This included most notably the fact of intelligibility of self and the word to the self. the structure of simultaneous self and world relation that constitute human existence, and the centrality of thinking to our distinctive mode of being. His own early methodology was in fact quite close to both that of Husserl and others in the modern tradition he criticized. Questions of ontology were pursued by analyzing the basic capacities and structures of those entities who have knowledge or understanding, us. In Being and Time, he even appropriates the central metaphor of self-transparency, characteristics of modern philosophy of consciousness, to describe the central requirement of his own analytic of Dasein, that it make an entity, the ontological inquirer, transparent in its being. Even as he moved away from the early project and its residual subjectivism, Heidegger always remained focused on questions concerning our openness to being and entities, questions which are recognizable descendants of questions earlier philosophers asked about consciousness. Just put in a pause there. So we continue here, and this is also from the Heidegger dictionary, page 35, and it's clearing. This is going to lead us up to temporality, what time is. Consciousness is time, I would say, as a little spoiler. This is from Sonia, Sikka. Previous was by Shockey. I will put the authors that Wrathall picked so eloquently. Clearing, Lichtung. Clearing names the illumination belonging to Dasein as a being who understands being, and who, through this understanding, discloses itself and the world. Heidegger first uses the term clearing, Lichtung, in Being and Time, entitled The Task of Thematic Analysis of Being in. Heidegger connects the disclosure of the clearing to traditional idea of the lumen naturale, or natural light, as a figurative description of human understanding. He adds, however, to say that it is illuminated means that as being in the world, it is cleared in itself, not, and this is important, not through any other entity, but in such a way that it is itself the clearing. And I have to say in parenthesis, this is one of the hardest things to understand. I struggled with that for years. How is it possible that it is in itself the clearing? While the German word Lichtung can be construed as connoting brightness, Heidegger does connect it here with a series of other terms involving illumination. It ordinarily means clearing, such as a clearing in a forest. The metaphor in this case is of an open site, cleared of the too dense proximity of things that renders them invisible. Well, that's what I understand it. The wood that you take away, that is also the clearing. So it's a removal, and that makes it possible to be itself. Heidegger is also emphatic in the passage that Dasein, the entity that I myself am, is itself the clearing. In being the kind of entity that it is, one that understands being and for which it is its own being is an issue. Dasein allows entities to step into the open or into the light. The there of Dasein. Within which it and the world are simultaneously disclosed, is the clearing. While such a disclosure can be described in terms of sight, as it often has been within the Western philosophical tradition, Heidegger cautions that sight and seeing should not be misinterpreted as just perceiving with the bodily eyes, or some pure non-sensory awareness of something, merely there as an object. It means rather allowing entities to be encountered unconcealedly in themselves, according to the analysis Heidegger gives in Being and Time. The disclosedness of Dasein is constituted by its having a self-reflexive relation to its own being, which it does not merely observe, but which matters to it, and a corresponding relation to other entities than itself. In other words, Dasein encounters itself, others, and things within the world on the basis of care, Sorge. That by which this entity is essentially cleared. In other words, that which makes it both open for itself and bright for itself, is what we have defined as care. Care is Heidegger's term for the being of Dasein as an entity whose own being matters to it and whose existence has the temporal structure of being always ahead of itself. Remember that, because we're stepping into temporality. You hear? Ahead of ourselves. Sorry about the spoiler. Already in a world and alongside entities encountered within that world. Dasein's understanding is structured by this temporality. It occurs in part through a projection of possibilities into the future and imagination of what may be. We call it priming. For instance, in the form of possible actions and ideas for one's own life, or scientific hypothesis anticipating a certain outcome. At the same time, it is guided and shaped by the inherited conception it has a for structure. For structure we mentioned with Robert Magliola. And then we also talked about the three different as structure, as is. Could you give me just a small drip of coffee? Sorry. Thank you. Highland coffee. The appearance of entities in the present, therefore, the way they are encountered as being, is not the product of pure intuition, a mere mirroring or reflection of what lies before Dasein. It is rather given form by varieties of anticipating and recalling, so that the clearing is temporally structured, the result of an apprehending in which projection and preconception are essentially involved. Consequently, the clearing is time-bound, situated within culture and history. It is always finite and bounded by obscurity. Emerging as a struggle to bring to light what lies as yet hidden in darkness, and it is opened up in the first place not by theoretical inquiry, but by care, which defines the being of Dasein. William Richardson, in his classic work on Heidegger, Through Phenomenology to Thought, glosses the term as indicating the luminosity of the there, disclosedness of the world. Which belongs to the basic existential constitution of Dasein. Hubert Dreyfus interprets this luminosity as a function of Dasein's being always in the world by way of being in a situation, dealing with something specific in the context of things and people, directed toward some specific end, doing what it does for the sake of being Dasein in some specific way. In Being and Time, the clearing is, on Dreyfus's reading, Dasein's shared situation, resulting from its common practices and activities in specific circumstances. You should move. Could you put a pause and we move to the side? The aspect of clearing Dreyfus emphasizes here, in accordance with the general thrust of his reading of Being and Time, is first that Dasein's engagement with the world it discovers takes place primarily through pragmatic activity, and second, that the intelligibility of that world rests on its being a shared world. Very important, shared world. So that each Dasein there is a shareable grasp of an already shared world. It doesn't become shared 2 times. It is already shared. Wondrous point. Mark Wrathall likewise interprets the clearing as a referring to a pre-predicative familiarity with the world, which makes it possible to point out an entity. But it's the same thing, pre-predicative familiarity and already being in the world. These interpretations focus on Being and Time, which describes Dasein as the source of the clearing. In subsequent works, Heidegger increasingly insists that while Dasein is the site of the clearing, it does not bring the clearing about through its own act. It's not intended like Husserl means. It is not an intention. Noimata, I think Husserl calls it. Rather, the clearing brings about Dasein, who is in a way needed for the disclosure of the world to happen. This point is touched on in the first of Heidegger's lecture courses on Schelling, where he uses the term clearing to explicate Schelling's theology. For Schelling, God needs humanity in order to become actual, to emerge into clarity, to be revealed. Understanding is the faculty to become actual, to emerge into clarity and be revealed. Understanding is the faculty of clearing. Heidegger comments where what is light is always the clearing of what is intertwined and entangled, what is veiled and obscure. While Heidegger is explicating rather than accepting Schelling's theology and metaphysics, His interpretation also contains insight that accord with the results of his own phenomenological investigations. One of these is the sense that the clearing of the world, constituted by multiple forms of human understanding, is not itself affected by human beings. We do not determine that we are this sight, nor do we determine its nature. In addition, Heidegger shares Schelling's sense that the emergence of humanity as a site for the clearing is necessitated by a process that transcends us, that there is a compelling need for disclosure, to which the existence of humanity is a response. The claim in Being and Time that Dasein is the clearing, in the sense that disclosure is dependent on its interpretation with all that these involve, can be read in a subjectivist fashion, where Heidegger is proposing that the human subject constructs reality. However, the later writings rejects this reading, emphasizing instead that Dasein is an open space in which the nature of things, the being of entities, is unconcealed or discovered, not fabricated. Well, I think the last fabricated is what everyone says today. It's such a different way of seeing things, so you get just stunned. In the Introduction to Metaphysics, for instance, first given as a lecture course in 1935, Heidegger writes that man should be understood within the question of being as the sight which being requires in order to disclose itself. Man is the site of openness, the there, so that the essence of Dasein as being there consists in its being a site for disclosure of being. At this juncture, Heidegger also sees disclosure or revealing as original truth. An idea? For which he finds warrant in what he takes to be the original sense of the Greek word aletheia, namely taking out of hiddenness. Humanity as the clearing is then also the site for the happening of truth. There is, on Heidegger's analysis, an intimate connection between the human capacity for such disclosure and freedom. The connection consists partly in the fact that the distance from entities, ourselves, others, things within the world, states of affairs, that allows us to have a relation with them as well as to imagine them as being possibly thus and not otherwise, is the source of freedom in the narrower and more customary sense as the capacity to choose a particular course of action. It consists also in the idea that freedom is involved in binding oneself to truth. Whether in the context of negotiating one's own existence or of scientific investigation, where the researcher is committed to discovery and accept evidence against projected hypotheses or anticipated results. For these reasons, Heidegger states in the On the Essence of Truth, an essay whose first version was delivered as a public lecture in 1930, that in the first place, freedom is engagement in the disclosure of entities as such. The existence of Dasein, which Heidegger had defined in Being and Time as being in the world, and connected with the future-oriented realization of projected possibilities, is now defined in terms of such disclosure. Disclosedness itself is conserved in existent engagement, through which the openness of the open region, i.e. the there, is what is. In 1933 to 34, Heidegger also gave a lecture course called On the Essence of Truth, in which he offers an interpretation of the metaphor of light in Plato's allegory of the cave. He notes that for the Greeks, the association of the ideas with light rests on the observation that an advanced knowledge of the essence of things is required for particular things to appear to our understanding as being such and such. That knowledge is granted by the ideas which we project in advance. The ideas therefore bestow the light in which particular things become visible. The highest idea is that of the good, conveyed in the sensory image of the sun. On Heidegger's reading, the good is the ultimate source of the light of understanding, because it determines the essential forms of things. That is the ordered arrangement through which they acquire their meaning so as to be unconcealed in their truth. At this point in time, Heidegger suggests that the projection of the good, rooted in the freedom of Dasein to creatively envision a fit order of things, gives the world its structure while binding Dasein to the realization of the possibility that lies beyond the actual. Thus, the good gives and it binds. We can see by now that clearing belongs to a cluster of semantically related terms, including disclosure, unconcealing, light, lighting, revealing, manifestness, the open, and truth as aletheia. By the mid-1930s, Heidegger comes to connect all of these terms with the idea that the ultimate source of human understanding, and thus of being human, since such understanding is what makes us what we are, is an event in which what is becomes visible and accessible. This becomes the event of happening in the clearing, bestowed upon us rather than accomplished through our own power. In The Origin of the Work of Art 35, he writes, and yet, beyond what is, not away from it, but before it, there is still something else that happens. In the midst of entities as a whole, an open place occurs. There is a clearing, a lighting. Thought of in reference to what is, to entities, this clearing is in greater degree than are entities. Very important. This open center is therefore not surrounded by what is. Rather, the lighting center itself encircles all that is. Like the nothing which we scarcely know. Very well chosen by Sonia Sikka. And of course this parallels also Edward de Bono's article in The Guardian, where he attacks the idea of staticness and says projection, temporality is important. That article got obliterated. We all strive for staticness, so even the future, the temporality itself, is explained in ontic manner by Ziondes. Determinism, as we heard from Sabine Hossenfelder yesterday, or the regular thinkers who all assume the future is putting things that already came to existence in a new order, and that is future, that is Dasein. And of course, if you have that mode or Stimmung, there is no Dasein anymore, or it's a constriction of Dasein. It cannot be open, it cannot shine, it cannot have light. And I think all of classical physics, the fight between Einstein and Heidegger, all circled on this very problem. What is the future? Heidegger is closer to quantum physics than Einstein. For him, temporality is not constructed of what already is. It's a complete newness. And he tried to convey that to us, we readers, in a way so that we can understand there is another possibility. Because without giving a metaphor, we cannot go into this new thinking. It is absolutely impossible. And then we have, like Einstein, we have to stick to the staticness. On the basis of passages like this, one, Reinhold May sees in Heidegger's later thought an identification of the clearing and nothing as the empty space in which what is appears, arguing for a connection between this idea and the pictograph for nothing in ancient Chinese thought. The pictograph for nothing we can put into the whiteboard later. It's called Mu.
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 The sound for the third chakra is mo, I think.
Could be, huh?
I learned yesterday.
Oh.
Mm. Mm.
Whatever his historical sources may have been, one way of understanding the distinctiveness of the notion of the clearing that Heidegger develops in the works like The Origin of the Work of Art is to position them against traditional Western conceptions of human understanding, noting what is being retained and what is being challenged and revised. With respect to what is retained, Heidegger is still speaking of understanding, connecting it with the metaphor of light, and proposing that this understanding defines the essence of human being. However, this is not the light of reason as traditionally understood in a number of respects. For one thing, the clearing is not equivalent to the correct representation or the giving of reasons. Well, yeah, it's not. It names a disclosure necessarily prior to all such acts and procedures. For with all our correct representations, we would get nowhere. We could not even presuppose that there already is manifest something to which we can conform ourselves, unless the unconcealedness of entities had already exposed us to, placed us in that lighted realm in which every being stands for us and from which it withdraws. So he's painting an incredibly different picture from what we are used to, and it's very important here. Without that picture, you will 100% be stuck in the static. You cannot force knowing. Dasein cannot be told. It needs to understand or see. The understanding of Dasein is in itself a Lichtung, not an Erkenntnis of the Erkenntnis. It is not understood by what we already know. That will be the same thing as before. We will be stuck in the Einsteinian dilemma. I have to read again, it's so good. With all our correct representations, we would get nowhere. We could not even presuppose that there already is manifest something to which we can conform ourselves, unless the unconcealedness of entities had already exposed us to, placed us in that lighted realm in which every being stands for us and from which it withdraws. The clearing is not first broken up by reason, nor is what comes to light within it limited to reason. Using Heidegger's illustration in the origin of the work of art, things within the world are disclosed to the peasant woman insofar as she dwells in the overtness of entities, of things that are. This dwelling does not only or primarily involve ratiocination. It occurs in the course of pragmatic engagement and in general through the way things enter the world of her experience, the way they touch her within the patterns of care that make up her life. Furthermore, This entry of things into the world occurs within a space that, as Heidegger outlined in Being and Time, is no less defined by the affect than by understanding, nor are these in practice truly separable. It is crucial to understand that the clearing never involves perfect luminosity, but is pervaded by a constant concealment in the double form of refusal and dissembling. Obscurity and disguise are permanent features of the clearing, and it follows that complete and perfect knowledge is possible for the kinds of entities that we are. Truth is therefore always partial, one in constant struggle with error. Heidegger does not see this as a regrettable human limitation. Rather, the borders of the clearing actually enable the visibility granted by it. In other words, the boundaries of our grasp of the world and ourselves, including the concepts that we inherit from our traditions, form the horizon within which we're able to understand. These concepts can be revised and expanded, but without a limiting horizon, nothing definite would show up for us at all. And that really blows up the idea of positivism, analytical philosophy, the earlier Tractatus, the early Wittgenstein with Tractatus, and modern thinking. We all, I would say everyone in this country, think that traditions, all forms of understanding, will block new understanding or impede it or change it, making it less. Heidegger means the opposite. Without limitations, without a pre-structure, there will be no understanding. And on top of that, there will be no objective understanding, shared. And this is also something Sabine Hossenfelder wouldn't accept, but comes from the understanding in relational quantum mechanics of Carlo Rovelli. The bounded character of the clearing, the fact that it is a space at whose borders there is necessarily concealment, is a central aspect of the metaphor. The borders of the Lichtung we ignored before, but those are essential, indicating the fact that any definite possibility of being and revealing will exclude others. There is always exclusion. For example, absurd pragmatic activity for which he finds variant in what he takes to be the original sense of the Greek word aletheia, namely taking out of hiddenness. Humanity as the clearing is then also the site for the happening of truth. There is, on Heidegger's analysis, an intimate connection between the human capacity for such disclosure and freedom. The connection consists partly in the fact that the distance from entities, ourselves, others, things within the world, states of affairs that allows us to have a relation with them, as well as to imagine them as being possibly thus and not otherwise, is the source of freedom in the narrower and more customary sense as the capacity to choose a particular course of action. It consists also in the idea that freedom is involved in binding oneself to truth, whether in the context of negotiating one's own existence or of scientific investigation, where the researcher is committed to discovery and accept evidence against projected hypotheses or anticipated results. For these reasons, Heidegger states On the Essence of Truth that, in the first place, freedom is engagement in the disclosure of entities as such. The existence of Dasein, which Heidegger had defined in Being and Time as being in the world and connected with a future-oriented realization of projected possibilities, is now defined in terms of such disclosure. Disclosedness itself is conserved in existent engagement, through which the openness of the open region, i.e. the there, da, is what is. Just give me a second, I lost my bearing here. Sorry, I lost my bearing here. One page is upside down and I went into the wrong direction. But it was a pretty just repetition there. Kalle, please.
Yes, it's exactly noon now, and I thought it's appropriate perhaps to show that we have now at noon both the moon still visible. Since we are speaking about clearing, so you see the moon there. Are you able to see it, Hans?
Yeah, I saw the moon before, yeah. It's
there. So it's exactly noon now. I wonder if you see it in the camera. Yes, you have there. And then you have the light there, since we are speaking about clearing. It's not... I was thinking about the Heraclitus fragment where he says that the day and the night are one and the same.
Oh yeah.
Now it's literally true. At
it
now.
Is. Yes, it is.
Never been as true as now at noon exactly.
Yeah.
We see the pulse.
And in ordinary thinking, if you compare the moon and the sun, the moon is darkness, one could say, because it shows itself at night. It's not knowing is in modern days always an obstacle. Not understand, not knowing, or the emptiness. But Heidegger says, without not knowing, without non-understanding, there can be no understanding whatsoever. So he is incredibly radical, and this is one of the reasons I want to put this in the lecture, because one needs a sort of transformation to get into that, and that needs to be of the body as well. Without that, it won't come. But Heidegger, he has a great gift. Oh, I can take some drop of coffee maybe.
Is this phenomenon a collusion, or is it, do you think there is a case like Heracles could actually observe at noon both the sun and the moon as we do?
We can take some questions
later. I'm distracting you.
Yes. The idea of being that dominates in a certain age also excludes possibilities. I could put in a parenthesis, this now fixatedness or now obsession, the idea that now 2022 everything is completely luminous. This is something questioned by Heidegger. I realize that now. And he put knowledge back into its place. I would say in modern time we are stepping on knowledge. We are making it a mat for our feet, for our shoes, shoe mat, stepping stone, ignoring it, despising it. The idea of being that dominates in a certain age also excludes possibilities. As Wrathall explains, a new understanding of being can establish itself, and a new ordering of beings can become operative. Only if there is something like a clearing that conceals any other way of experiencing the world, in order to allow this particular way to come to the forefront. The clearing is, he notes, a space of possibilities, and the possibilities that can be actual at one time are always a definite set. Heidegger therefore speaks of the terms in the history of being as involving a kind of decision, although in this case the decision is not the act of an individual or group of individuals. The metaphor of the clearing suggests that the basic concepts accepted in a certain historical period are limited, with the excluded possibilities being hidden from view, and also that the fact of this limitation is hidden. So the fact of the limitation is something we can never see. It can never be revealed. And not understanding that will make you not understanding what knowledge is. Or thinking that is possible will make you ignorant. This does not mean, however, that for Heidegger, truth is merely a matter of human perspective and is therefore subjective. Emphasizing this point becomes an important element in Heidegger's reflections during the years following his disillusionment with Nazism and resignation from the rectorate in 1934. In his notebooks from this period, Heidegger's occasional reference references to the clearing, asserts the idea of humanity as a site for the happening of truth, in opposition to what he thinks is the metaphysical conception of humanity that informs the modern age, of which he sees Nazism as a symptom. Adaptation is the clearing of being, is now presented as a countermeasure to the idea of humanity as a rational animal, seeking to master the world in accordance with its own needs and drives. This point is developed in the Contributions to Philosophy, composed between 1936 and 39, where Heidegger describes the thinking that belongs to Dasein, not as a subjective occurrence, but as a clearing in which the fullness of presencing of being concealedly discloses itself. He still affirms that projection, Eintwurf, is involved in the disclosure of truth. However, the nature of this projection, he maintains, is covered up when it is interpreted as a representation in the context of subject-object relation. The original projection that enables things to show up for our understanding is the clearing, the basics disclosure within which correctness is measured. Heidegger adds that if truth here means the clearing of being as openness in the midst of what is, then the truth of this truth cannot be questioned. Given the historical character of the clearing within Heidegger's later thought, where different historical epochs are characterized by different basic views of humanity and being, the idea can be seen as supporting anti-realism. Lee Braver, in line with his anti-realist reading of Heidegger, proposes that this new conception of the clearing as imparting a particular character to all beings of the epoch is the later Heidegger's version of the anti-realist conceptual scheme. On this interpretation, Heidegger's rejection of subjectivism in his later thought replaces the idea of the individual subject as the ultimate source of meaning, as well as the Kantian idea of the subject possessing a universal set of fundamental categories, with that of the basic understanding that are given in language and vary between cultures and epochs. On the other hand, it is noteworthy that when Heidegger speaks of the understanding, he always uses language that connotes discovering rather than fabricating. In contrast with, for instance, Nietzsche, the notion of clearing is an important element within this language. It can then also be interpreted as supporting realism, serving to counter the modern idea of ourselves as imposing representation upon the world to generate what we call knowledge, and acting accordingly to our humanely created values. Torbjörn Tännsjö. Yes, not joking. Heidegger seems to search in early Greek thought. The sayings of the pre-Socratics for an alternative possibility to this modern one. In this context, he uses the term Lichtung with verbal variations in a meditation on Heraclitus's understanding of aletheia, or truth, first composed in 1943. On Heidegger's reading, Heraclitus's notion of aletheia involves an event whereby human beings, along with the gods, are cleared in the sense of both lit and set into the free. They are a light where the event of lighting is the world. This event, for which human beings are adapted, brings into the open and reveals. It allows what is to come to presence. Thus Heidegger arguably finds in the pre-Socratic sense that, in John Richardson's words, the clearing is something we undergo or receive. That being is not something we accomplish ourselves. It doesn't issue from an act of projection in the strong sense of being and time. Richardson adds that for Heidegger, this is the element of realism in the original Greek viewpoint. The clearing happens by our receiving being, not creating it. It would then also be the element of realism, or more neutrally, of anti-subjectivism in Heidegger's own later thought. Heidegger's clearest articulation of anti-subjectivism in relation to the clearing and retroactive explanation of how he meant the term in being in time occurs in the letter of humanism. He glosses the statement being made in being in time, that the essence of Dasein lies in its existence, as meaning that. So here we get an explanation from the man himself, Martin Heidegger. Man occurs essentially in such a way that he is the there. That is the clearing of being, and the being of the Da, and only it, has the fundamental character of existence, that is, of an ecstatic inheritance. in the truth of being, an ecstatic inherence in the truth of being. So Dasein differs from other living creatures in the virtue of being this clearing, and the clearing is established through its standing in a way outside of its being, and at the same time the being of things within the world. This distance, which permits an understanding of being in its actuality and possibility, is what constitutes the world. The clearing is also the source of language, as the articulation of being. So language is the articulation of being. Could be the frequency, I would say a vibration of being. The vibration of being is what language is. Not words, not symbols, not signs for something, but the very vibration. Human beings are capable of language because they have the ecstatic relation to being described above, whereas because plants and animals are lodged in their respective environments but are never placed freely in the clearing of being, which alone is the world, they lack language. Language is not the expression of a living thing, but rather the clearing, concealing advent of being itself. These ideas have significant implications for the notion of projection as developed in Being and Time. Heidegger had claimed in Being and Time that Dasein's understanding of being is based on projection, Entwurft. Remember Entwurf, a term that ordinarily means to sketch or design. Thus, he had partially agreed with Kant that knowledge is not a matter of pure reception, but involves a throwing in advance. The literal meaning of projection, Entwerfen. Although Being and Time suggests that we primarily throw in advance are not categories determining the nature of objects, but possibilities of our own being, in relation to which we interpret what we come across. So this flies in the eye of Sabine Hossenfeld. And what is it? Well, let me just ponder about this. What Sabine brings into the business already before she starts her scientific career is what we have already of the modern world, our way of understanding things as determined by what already is, and that she brought into science, and therefore her conclusions are necessary for her and for many other peoples as well. But for some reason, Carlo Rovelli challenged that view. It took him years. So he came to a Heideggerian understanding that being is a projection, not a Sein, not beings. Given the Kantian heritage of this idea, Heidegger's position could be interpreted as endorsing subjectivism, but this is the interpretation he emphatically rejects in the letter of humanism. If we understand what being in times calls projection as the representational positing, we take it to be an achievement of subjectivity and do not think it in the only way, the understanding of being in the context of the existential analysis of being in the world. Just little drop this time.
So it needs highlight because it needs a shaking?
No. It doesn't matter.
Right in the front.
Namely, as the ecstatic relation to the clearing of being. Accordingly, when it is written in Being and Time that only so long as Dasein is there being, the sentence does not say that beings is the product of man. It says rather that only so long as the clearing of being occurs, does being convey itself to man. Consequently, what throws in projection is not man, but being itself, which sends man into the existence of Dasein, that is his very essence. This destiny occurs and propagates as the clearing of being which it is, and it does so in the form of language, as that in which being has its home. Being comes clearing itself to language, and thinking attends to the clearing of being in that it puts its saying of being into language. A couple of years later, in the introduction to What is Metaphysics, Heidegger makes the further point that the clearing, the lighting of self and the world that Dasein always brings with it is prior to the kind of reflective determination of the essence of things that characterizes metaphysics, although it is not thematized by metaphysical inquiry. Wherever metaphysics represents entities, Heidegger writes, being has been cleared. It has arrived in a state of unconcealedness, so that it always speaks from the unnoticed manifestation of being. Increasingly, moreover, Heidegger's attempt to articulate the primordiality of, or basicness of, the clearing leads him to reject earlier equations between Lichtung and light, as well as truth. Dahlstrom, a name to be remembered, Dahlstrom points out that this shift in the connotations of clearing over the course of Heidegger's writing, noting that when Heidegger turns to his account of the clearing as the truth, not primarily of Dasein, but of being, he drops the association with light in favor of the normal use of the term for a fortuitous opening in a forest. And this is both from Dahlström and Capobianco. Now the clearing is that within which things present and absent themselves, so that Dasein may take note of them. It is then prior to the human natural, and lies within the power of being, not Dasein. By the time we reach the very late work, the end of philosophy and the task of thinking, Heidegger goes so far as to say, what is light in the sense of being free and open has nothing in the common with the adjective light, which means bright, neither linguistically nor materially. That is because light presupposes the primal phenomena of the clearing, which is not only free for brightness and darkness, but also for resonance and echo, for sound and the diminishing of sound. Philosophy does not pay attention to this free openness, presupposed by the lumen naturale, the light of reason. The latter does not create, but throws light only on the open. That is an important difference, and it takes to stay free from the idea that lights shine upon the things and illuminates them, and therefore they seep into existence. No, the clearing and the Dasein is to some extent the very same thing. And that means also the unclearing, the borders, are part of it, not obstructions or things to be ignored. Remember the apeiron, it's the situ of knowledge and borders that we ignore and fear. We fear it for the wrong reason. We fear it as being vacuum, nothing. The latter does not create, but throws light only on the open. Even darkness needs the clearing. After all, since we happen upon darkness, wander through it. Likewise, the clearing is more basic than evidence, correspondence, or correctness. All such processes of discovery and verification presupposes the openness through which we have primary access to things. So not verification, not evidence, because they presupposes what already happened. For this reason, Heidegger now thinks it was immaterial and therefore misleading to call aletheia in the sense of clearing truth. The matter at issue here is a kind of break with being which established a distinction between being and thinking, what makes human beings the special kind of entity that they are is that they are the site of this break. Released from immersion with their immediate needs and environment, they stand at a distance from what is, so as to be able to apprehend it and respond in a thoughtful manner. Thus, the quiet heart of the clearing is the place of stillness from which alone the possibility of the belonging together of being and thinking, that is, presence and apprehending, can arise at all. So, if that is not in situ, there is no arising of neither thinking nor existence. The clearing, the distance from things that enables us to experience their nearness, is therefore the ultimate source of our capacity to name, wonder, question, and imagine. Heidegger's final reference to the clearing occurs in On the Question Concerning Determination of the Matter for Thinking, the first version of which was delivered as a talk in 1965. It reiterates the dissociation of clearing from light, connecting the term instead with freeing from obstructions, lightening in the sense of making light. Heidegger uses the metaphor of raising an anchor. To raise Lichtung, the anchor, says as much to free it from the encompassing ocean floor and lift it into the free of water and air. Again, Heidegger presupposes that this freeing is what established the character of the entity he had called Dasein in being and time. He adds a clarification. The Dasein is the clearing for presence as such, and yet Dasein is, at the same time, certainly not the clearing insofar as the clearing is Dasein in the first place. That is, insofar as the clearing grants Dasein as such. The clearing then grants the temporality and spatial proper to Dasein, which are the preconditions for its apprehension on what is. In sum, the semantic content, or at least emphasis, of the term Lichtung shifts from illumination to freeing over the course of Heidegger's writings, and in the later works, Dasein is said to depend on the clearing rather than the other way around. Nonetheless, there is a fundamental continuity of meaning as well, in that the term always points toward a special relation to being that opens access to the being of entities and make human understanding possible. The clearing is and remains the bounded space of the world within such understanding occurs. It was rather longish. Thank you, Sonia, Sikka. Conclusions to this is, well, I now finally realize why Vorhanden is not a lesser variety of Zuhanden. And by distancing us, we understand, we define, we determine, we categorize, and we conceptualize. That does not hinder us to be in the world. There is no opposition there. They both exist at the same time. And understanding that, the Lichtung helps. I don't see how anyone can come to that understanding, which take, I would say, the body, and I actually place myself here because this is a clearing in itself. Now, and this border is not unnecessary. It is part of what constructs. Borders are not obstacles. They are part of the becoming. Any questions?
Yes, some remarks. You said earlier that, or the article said that the concealment, we shouldn't live in the self-deception that we can uncover the coveredness, the hiddenness. Did I understand correctly?
Yes, almost correct. Yeah, it's a very tough sentence. It's one of the toughest in this article, and it means the misunderstanding, more or less, the misunderstanding that the covered things should be uncovered, and that we should, or it would be a good thing if we understand the limitations of our own thinking. What is hidden for us 2022, if we understood our position in knowledge, so to speak, what is being covered, it is not very hard to understand. Of course, we know that, how the Lichtung changes during time, but I always assumed it could be a good thing to uncover how it changes and what new things become covered. But Heidegger says no, that means that you haven't understood, and it would be a mistake to do it. And I would say, my take on it, it is impossible also, but that's my take.
And, okay, another thing, you mentioned Dahlström earlier, and I looked him up. His whole name is Daniel Dahlström. Probably he might have some Swedish ancestry, but he's an American philosopher at Boston University, and now in September 22 he has edited a book about Heidegger logic.
Oh, very good.
Interesting. And but the last thing was it was my first question about the moon, and we still have the moon. We can see it, although it's about 12:30. We can still see the moon there. So, do you think Heraclitus he could see the moon like this clearly, or is it a pollution only?
It's wondrous. It's really beautiful.
Do you see it also there?
Yeah.
And does it depend only on the pollution, do you think? Could it be?
No, that's the moon. That's the moon.
That you see it as clearly? Or yeah, perhaps we compare it with clearing. Sometimes the hiddenness, that is the moon, in this case perhaps, you can see it at the same time as the clearing itself, that is sometimes they appear at the same time. In rare cases, like in today, September 17th.
Yeah, you can compare it to yin and yang and ha and ta. Ta is the moon, ha is the sun. And moon stands for the earth, the darkness, the border, the hiddenness. Well, I think we'll conclude there. I think it was long enough. And,
yes.
I will put in the description the different articles, and I say thank you very much for your patience and have a very nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you.